Our first scripture reading this morning comes from Genesis, the 12th chapter. I have been reading from Genesis for a long time. I realized this week that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are early, before humanity, stories setting the creation, talking about the life that people live in. And then from chapter 12 to the end of Genesis is the story of Abraham and Sarah's family as they lived together, as they had marital problems. Now, some of you have avoided marital problems by not being married, but those of you who are married know that there are situations that could be called problematic if you didn't deal with them. Abraham and Sarah's family had all those things. They had sibling rivalries. The story of Abraham and Sarah's family begins today with our scripture lesson. Reading from chapter 12 of Genesis, verses 1 through 4. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "We have no evidence of why Abraham. But now the Lord said to Abraham, 'Go from this country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And if you all in the families of the earth shall be blessed.' So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with them." Simple, but the beginning of a whole family's history, with all the ins and outs of living together, moving through life together. Our second passage is from the Gospel according to Matthew. It is, as is known, the story of the Transfiguration. Our text today follows discussion, fights between the religious leaders of the day and Jesus. I have more to say, but I need to find my notes. In this passage, the passage of the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah are mentioned as leaders in the family of Abraham and Sarah. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were those who had evolved into leadership positions of the family of Abraham and Sarah, as they, for generations, had moved to deal with their life in the presence of God. Listen as Jesus takes Peter, James, and John into the hillside, into the mountains, away from these discussions with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Listen what happens when they go away, what they see, and what they do. Reading from Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to those three disciples, to them appeared Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." When he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the blessed and beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome with fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up and saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Peter was forgiven. I hope you will forgive me, because I'm going to change the sermon title. I asked a friend of mine, "Do you read the sermon title before the sermon?" She says, yes, I often do, but sometimes it doesn't make any sense. You have that experience with sermon titles? Well, this one was on the bulletin, was created 3 weeks ago. As I worked on that sermon for this service in the last week, I think a better sermon would be God's faithfulness and our response. So if you can picture the sermon title in the worship bulletin saying God's faithfulness and our response, it'll make more sense to me of what I'm going to say. There is no biblical evidence on why from all of humanity existing at the time, would God choose Abraham? There is no biblical evidence of why God chose Abraham and his wife Sarah to be the ones who took the message, who created the messengers, who had children, who had children, who had children, who had children. Believe it or not, our lives go on. Abraham and Sarah received God's promise. Now picture this. Some of you have grown up in Boxborough. You know Boxborough, you know people in Boxborough, you know the space of Boxborough. Can you picture God coming to you and saying, "Come on, it's time to go. I've given you a new land. It's time to leave everything you know. All your friends, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, everybody, everything you knew, and leave it behind." Because, God says, I have something else in mind for you. God says to Abraham and Sarah, I will make you a great nation. Huh? God says to Abraham and Sarah, I will bless you and defend you from those who curse you. I can understand that. But why can't that happen here? Why can't that happen where I live? God then says, your lives and your family's life will be a blessing to the world. Huh? Why? Why me? God was faithful to that promise to Abraham and Sarah. He showed them a new land. He protected the family from the family itself as well as from the environment. You know the story. You know their child, Isaac. He was not a perfect human being. If you haven't read that story, I encourage you to look at that. And then after Isaac, there was Jacob and Esau. A part of the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. And then from them, their children and their children's children and their children's children. God was always faithful to his promise. He supported them, and they did their own thing. He forgave them and supported them. God was always faithful to his promise to Abraham and Sarah. In their response, in the moment of their response, at the time they responded to God's permanent promise to be their God, to lead them in a new land, to bless them, that they might bless the earth. God was always faithful to that. Abraham and Sarah's kids and grandchildren and great-grandchildren weren't always so faithful in their response. Now for the story of the Transfiguration. I don't pretend to understand that. I'm not the kind of person who was called to Christianity or called to ministry with a vision. I don't doubt that people do have visions. I have not been blessed with one. Perhaps you have. Perhaps you have not. But in this vision that Peter, James, and John had of Jesus, standing with historical figures of reputation, of good reputation, standing Jesus with people who were a part of the faith, a part of the religious community, who were faithful in their response to God's placing on them situations. The vision was of these two historical figures standing with Jesus, one that they knew, a person that they knew, a person with whom they had eaten, a person with whom they had struggled. Here stands one that they know with two they have heard about. You know, Peter is a very, very interesting character. I mean, you've heard of Peter, James, and John. Some people carry important names with them. They mess up. Peter messed up. Peter got it wrong. I get it wrong. I don't know you well enough to know you the times you have gotten it wrong, but I'll bet there are times when you wish you hadn't responded as you had responded in hindsight. Jesus said, "No, Peter. We don't want to make of this moment, of this visionary moment that you have been granted, we do not want to make it permanent. We don't want to build houses, a neighborhood. We want to take the vision, being a part of the historic work of God, the historic living out the promise of God in the moment that you experienced it. We don't want to build a house. That's not what we're about. We're not about making our response or God's promise concrete, but we are about keeping it open. Keeping it open so that God can change it if God chooses to change it. So God can make something out of something that you have seen, that you have heard, make something of that that is important to the will of God, to the promise of God. When I graduated from seminary, having done an intern year, on my intern year, had more dinners with single women and their parents, so that they could meet this young 27-year-old, not unattractive, young man going into the ministry. Oh, Mom and Dad were so excited. Grandmother was so excited when granddaughter's coming home from college and has dinner with this granddaughter. And the pastor, I had gotten so sick and tired of being set up with women I wasn't at all interested in. When I graduated from seminary, I went to work for the YMCA. I got fired. I'd never been fired before. I have been fired since. But I got fired. And I spent a long time trying to sort through what I did next. And so to fill up the time, my wife and I volunteered to lead the junior high youth group at the First Baptist Church in West Hartford, Connecticut. Now, I don't know what your experience of church fellowships have been. But my experience, and therefore the experience I provided as a leader, was to have sleepovers. Get out of the house to spend a night sleeping in sleeping bags on the floor of the church library or the fellowship hall. What joy! Well, it was a lot of fun for the junior highs. Well, 2 people can't supervise 20 junior highs. So Beth and I invited our really good friends, George and Sue Ellenboss. Now, some of you know George Ellenboss. Some of you knew Sue Ellenboss, active members of this congregation. At the sleepover, we had a little closing Vesper service. You know, we want to make this social experience have some religious dimension. So my wife and I led a little devotional service in the sanctuary of the church. And George and Sue were there, you know. And after the service, I went out the side door of the chancel. My wife had left the leadership position and gone and sat with George and Sue. I go out the side door, and the 8th graders are filing by. And one of them says, "Gee, Rich, that wasn't bad." How many of you know 8th graders? I took that as a great compliment. So they went back to their sleeping abode, and I went down underneath the sanctuary and came up in back of the sanctuary, and here is Sue sitting with her back to the back of the sanctuary. And George and my wife, Beth, were standing facing Sue. I walk into the sanctuary, complete silence. So I walked up the center aisle and was standing behind Sue. And George and Beth said nothing. In a few minutes, Sue turned around with tears running down her cheeks. And I won't use all the expletives that she probably used, but the basic point was, when are you going to get something to do where you get to do what you just did with those kids on a regular basis? Sue used to say to me, "No, I wasn't a part of your call to ministry. God was a part of your call to ministry." I said, "No, Sue, you put words on it." I used to say to my wife, I think I'm going to get ordained. I'd had the seminary training. I think I'm going to get ordained because I want to tell people God loves you with whatever they're facing. And Beth came to pick me up at the hospital. I'd been in ministry now for 3-4 weeks. And David, 13-year-old boy, and I went for a walk. And we both got hit by a car. And he died. I rode to the hospital with David in the back of the ambulance, with his mother in the front seat with me and the driver. Dead silence. As I sat with David, even after he was pronounced dead, and his father and his mother, I said, as I said to one of you today, what am I doing here? And when my wife came to pick me up at the hospital after David's dad had come from work and the family was there, and I called my wife and she stopped on her way home from work and picked me up, and we're driving 30 miles from the hospital to our home, and I said to her, "What am I doing?" And she said, "You always said you wanted to be in a situation where you could tell people by what you said and what you did that God loved them. You got a chance to do that." And I said, "But so soon? Let me get my feet under me." That is how I started ministry. That experience and all the experiences I've had in ministry for years are all momentary. It happens. And we deal with it as best we can. That's our response. We don't make it permanent. We don't build walls around it like Peter wanted to do. We don't make something that's stationary that you can look at and remember. We're left with looking for what God expects of us today, not yesterday. I went to church camp. Any of you gone to church camp? This was junior high church camp. And we had a bonfire, first night. And one of the ministers, bless his heart, says that the reason mosquito bites itch is because we don't let them finish. If you let them suck until they're done sucking the blood, then they won't itch. I'm still gullible. I believed them. So the next morning on morning watch, I'm sitting out in the woods all by myself with the assigned psalm to read and think about. And it was quiet, and it was really pleasant. And the words of the psalm, were resonating in me. And I'm sitting there, and a mosquito lands right there. And I said, "Well, let him finish, and it won't itch." Well, he didn't finish, but I had all I could take. And it itched. I realized, not at the time, but I have come to realize that the minister who was leading this bonfire for these 8th graders was telling a joke. I didn't know ministers told jokes. I believed him. From my experience, I want you to know God does not tell jokes when God is talking about his promise. God does not tell jokes when he's helping you live out your disappointments and your failures. He loves. He wants the best for you. I'm sorry. I was very young when I thought, is it possible that Jesus could have been a woman? That's not in my notes. So if that's confusing, we can talk about that later. But, you know, God is a mother father, not a father. He carries God. See? God carries the image and the function of both male and female. So be assured that God is not joking when he says, I love you. God is not joking when God says to you in some way, a vision is on the Mount of Transfiguration, a vision from your own life. God says to you, I love you. It is no joke. God must have a sense of humor, but that's a different sermon. So God is always faithful to his promise. He was faithful to Abraham and Sarah. He was faithful to their family. God, has been faithful to me. May you see God as faithful to you, as he tells again and again the promise that he told to Abraham and Sarah. Again and again. God's faithfulness is permanent. Our experience of that promise is momentary. It happens, it inspires, it comforts, and we move on. May you know the promise of God as you move from this place in your life to the next place in your life. God moves with you, and God's not joking. Now, I need to find my worship bulletin. What's next? Thank you. She wasn't joking. It's there. Does that make you God? No. We did in our preparation for the service, left some things out of the worship bulletin. One thing we left out was prayer. So we're going to do that even though it's not in your bulletin. Forgive me for misleading.